Book nibbles. Big ideas, small bites. The story begins with a girl walking into the woods behind her home, noticing something strange in the shadows, something whispered from unseen edges. And that girl is Mary Galvin, later known as Lindsay, who senses there is something unsettling under the calm surface of her family's life. Over the years, her memories will return in fragments, haunted by the weight of what she and her siblings endured, and by the siblings lost to a darkness that took hold of minds. That early image of nature, of boundary and creeping fear, frames the larger story. A family with 12 children, 6 of whom would be diagnosed with schizophrenia, becoming both tragedy and scientific beacon, a crucible in which the mysteries of mental illness would be probed through the suffering of real lives. Don and Mimi Galvin married in 1956, both devout Catholics with high ambitions and ideals. Don, drawn originally to academia, instead found a stable career in the Air Force, which eventually settled him in Colorado Springs. Mimi, cultured and intelligent, had dreams of intellectual fulfillment, social life, culture, and friendships beyond the narrow role of housewife. But they subsumed themselves in the conventions of the era, the Catholic family ideal, the post-war American dream of domesticity and upward mobility. They had 12 children over 2 decades, 10 boys and 2 girls, beginning with Donald in 1945, then Jim, John, Brian, Michael, Richard, Joseph, Mark, Matt, Peter, Margaret, and Mary, Lindsay in 1965. The house on Hidden Valley Road in Colorado Springs was supposed to hold the fullness of their ambitions. Musical training, sports, academic excellence, neighborliness. But the facade would fracture under pressures few could imagine. As the children grew, the family presented a kind of perfection. All wore starch collars, played instruments, went to school, practiced discipline. Yet behind closed doors, the overwhelming weight of so many children, the struggles of financial constraints, the exhaustion of parenting, and the complex interactions among siblings blurred lines. In a household that was crowded, siblings often watched over siblings. The older took responsibility for younger, sometimes too much. The responsibility and burden created a shifting hierarchy, and the cracks in relationships showed themselves early. When older boys physically abused younger, when behaviors were ignored or minimized by parents who were overwhelmed, when secrets were kept or shamed rather than confronted. Mimi, for all her intelligence and devotion, was sometimes overextended. Don, rigid and proud, often retreated into silence. The children, in their multiple interactions, absorbed both affection and neglect, guidance and invisibility, moral rules and emotional starvation. In the mid-1970s, the family's life would be irrevocably changed. One by one, the Galvin boys experienced psychotic breaks and were diagnosed with schizophrenia. Peter was the first to emerge with symptoms, delusions, paranoia, voices collapsing into a world of suspicion. After him came Don Jr., Jim, Brian, Matthew, Joseph. At its deepest point, 6 of the 10 brothers were institutionalized, medicated, hospitalized, or in and out of facilities. The burden of managing them, caring for them, defending them from stigma was enormous. For the 2 sisters, Margaret and Lindsay, witnessing and internalizing that suffering was part of their lives, never peripheral but always core. Kolker, as an investigative journalist, was approached by Margaret and Lindsay to tell the family's history. He visited, interviewed, collected letters, medical records, and DNA contributions. He blends the personal history of the Galvins with the history of psychiatry, genetics, neuroscience, and shifting social perceptions around mental illness. The narrative alternates between the Galvins' lived tragedy and the scientific quest to understand schizophrenia, illuminating that disease not as abstract pathology, but has lived terror, an anomaly in relationship, identity, and family. One recurring tension in the book is the debate that had raged in psychiatry for decades. Was schizophrenia caused by bad mothering, cold mothers, psychogenic upbringing, the so-called schizophrenic mother theory? Or was it a biological illness, genetic and brain-based? In the 1950s, 70s, many psychiatrists blamed mothers, especially ambitious or distant ones, for causing schizophrenia in children. Mimi Galvin, as a high-achieving, intellectual, emotionally complex woman, could be cast in that mold by critics, even though she wrestled with guilt, fury, confusion, and love all her life. The Galvins were, in a sense, a generational battleground for ideas. Was mental illness moral failure or biological disaster? As each brother collapsed, their symptoms and trajectories offered vivid, painful vignettes. Peter, once active, charismatic, athletic, gradually withdrew, hearing voices, locking doors, distrusting friends. Joseph, an artist and sensitive soul, displayed dramatic swings, sometimes painting in fevered states, sometimes catatonic, sometimes violent, or so the report said. Brian, the intellectual, tried fiercely to maintain control, but delusions intruded. Jim, impulsive, volatile, could shift from calm to aggression. Matthew, younger, would see his brothers disappear into the hospitals and wonder when it might be his turn. Each brother's path was unique, and each triggered guilt, hope, despair in the family. One of the powerful tensions is that the Galvin family, in their suffering, became scientific gold. The National Institute of Mental Health, NIM, recruited them as subjects in genetic studies because no family had ever had so many siblings with schizophrenia. The logic was, if you can find the gene or genes, you can unlock schizophrenia. The Galvins consented, offering blood, tissue, history, in the hope that their anguish might not be in vain. Their personal disaster became bridge to scientific progress. Kolker follows the molecular history, how researchers studied linkage, attempted to find chromosomal markers, looked for de novo mutations, studied mitochondrial DNA, and faced false leads, technical dead ends, and ethical dilemmas. The Galvin's DNA would seed decades of work on the genetics of psychosis, with both promise and disappointment. Kolker does not flatten the story into a purely scientific narrative. He illustrates the suffering and moral ambiguity of treatment. Schizophrenia, by mid-century, had been treated with shock therapy, lobotomy, over-medication, institutionalization, isolation, and often trauma. Families watched as loved ones were given medication that fatally weakened their bodies or locked away without contact, or worse, neglected in understaffed hospitals. The Galvins' experience included these horrors. At times, brothers would vanish for months under sediment of institutional bureaucracy or emerge stunted, dulled, traumatized. In one scene, a brother returns from hospital, a shell of his former self. The family struggles to integrate him back at home, but the transition is impossible. The mind that belonged to them is altered. Another brother, in a violent state, breaks windows, throws chairs, scenes of terror that frightened even the therapists. The girls remember hiding in closets, listening. Mimi remembers the broken walls. The family's daily rhythms became punctuated by crisis. Emergency hospital calls, police interventions, medications in midnight doses, fights, pleading, hope, betrayal. The sisters, Margaret and Lindsay, carry the memory and the conflict. Margaret, older, was sent away to boarding school by her parents, partly as refuge and partly because they could not manage all of their children. That distance saved her from seeing some of the worst, but the emotional impact was enormous. She felt abandoned, guilty, responsible. Lindsay, younger, later changed her name, distanced herself, but always wrestled with her connection to her family. In adulthood, she came to see that she had been abused by Jim, a brother with schizophrenia, that parts of her life were shaped by secrecy, shame, and silence. She wanted to tell the story so that suffering would not be hidden, so that empathy might rise, so that stigma might recede. She sought for meaning in devastation. Kolker weaves in the perspectives of neuroscientists, geneticists, and psychiatrists, people like Dr. Mary Claire King, who look for genetic links between schizophrenia and breast cancer genes, or other researchers who scrutinize microdeletions, epigenetics, the role of environmental stress, prenatal exposures. He presents the concept of the two-hit hypothesis, that a genetic susceptibility, first hit, plus an environmental insult, second hit, might trigger disease. He examines the difficulties of studying schizophrenia: lack of clear pathology, heterogeneity of patients, poor animal models, the complexity of brain circuits. He recounts false leads, genes once thought promising, but later disproven, small sample sizes, p-hacking, patient heterogeneity, the impossibility of isolating schizophrenia gene. He also recounts new directions, polygenic risk scores, large consortium studies, epigenetic modifications, and the hope that someday early detection or prevention may be possible. Among the scientifically rich chapters, Kolker inserts quietly humanizing stories. One physician recalls visiting patients in wards where plumbing was broken, patients were strapped, staff were overworked, how the system itself inflicted harm, not just the disease. He tells of siblings of patients who themselves battle depression, anxiety, or guilt, children deprived of attention, carrying the emotional scars of watching siblings fade. He includes letters, fragments of journal entries, bits of memory from Mimi, from Dawn, from the children, to allow the voices of the Galvins to speak through the clinical fog. A recurrent theme is the concept of expression versus illness. Many people may carry traits or markers of schizophrenia without full-blown psychosis. The boundary between normal and pathological is vague. Siblings display oddness, subclinical symptoms, extra sensitivity. The concept of penetrance, the idea that a gene or variant may or may not fully express disease in any individual, is central. Just because someone carries risk does not guarantee they manifest illness. The Galvins help illustrate this. Some siblings, though genetically similar, never develop psychosis. Kolker also spotlights moral challenges: consent, privacy, the burden of being subject, the weight of family history. Margaret and Lindsay wrestle with whether telling this story publicly is an ethical breach, whether their brothers, sometimes dead, sometimes incapacitated, would have consented. The balance between privacy and voice is delicate. The sisters want to give their family dignity and to stop stigma, but they also open wounds. Kolker handles this with care, striving to center empathy and transparency about limitations. Over time, the narrative tension shifts from tragedy toward cautious hope. Scientists begin to understand that schizophrenia is not one disease, but many, that genetic architecture is vast, and that risk is distributed across thousands of variants, each contributing a little. Large collaborations like the Psychiatric Genomics Consortium amass huge datasets to pick small signals from noise. The Galvin DNA is part of that, a goodwill token from a family that offered themselves to science. As research progresses, biomarkers, imaging studies, and early intervention trials show glimmers. Can prodromal signs be caught before full psychosis? Can medications be gentler, more precise? Can gene therapies or novel treatments one day reduce the burden? Kolker does not promise the moon, but he allows hope to emerge, not of cure, but of better understanding, earlier recognition, less stigma, more compassion. In the end, the story returns to the human faces. Don dies in 2003. Mimi dies in 2017. Brothers Joseph and Peter die prematurely. The survivors carry pain, memory, fragile hope. Margaret and Lindsay take responsibility for safeguarding their family's legacy. The final pages evoke how love persisted despite trauma, how memory molds identity, how families fight for dignity in the face of disease. The Galvins remain a family, though scarred. Their story is neither cautionary gospel nor easy moral lesson. It is raw, ambiguous, human, and full of grief and fragile redemption. From the text, several lessons or deep takeaways emerge, not in didactic form, but woven through the lives. Mental illness is profoundly relational. You cannot separate the disease from the lives it touches. The disease lives in the body and the mind, but also in the family, in memory, in guilt, in secrecy. Science progresses in fits and starts, not linear miracles. The Galvins' DNA contributions were meaningful, even though no single schizophrenia gene was simple to find. The work is cumulative, collaborative, messy. Empathy and narrative matter. The story of the Galvins fights stigma by humanizing the brokenness, forcing readers to see not the schizophrenic, but a person, a brother, a son, a sibling caught in disease. The boundary between health and illness is blurry. Risk factors, subclinical traits, gene-environment interactions complicate any bright line. Families carry both damage and resilience. The cost is heavy, but love, memory, commitment persist. The sisters' decision to tell the story is itself an act of healing. Imperfect, but necessary. From a practical perspective, the book offers lessons in how to read stories of mental illness. Don't flatten them into triumph or pathology. See complexity. Resist blame narratives. Insist on the voices of lived experience. And hold science and humanity in tension, not supremacy. In one striking example, Kolker recounts a moment when a researcher visits the Galvin home and observes a display of family pictures and certificates. The juxtaposition of trophies, diplomas, and photos before schizophrenia with the emptied chairs and absent brothers reminds us. These are not merely patients, but children, siblings, young men whose presence once shaped day-to-day life. That visual contrast anchors the tragedy in flesh, not abstraction. In another, Lindsay meets a patient in a hospital ward who has trouble spelling her own name. She wonders whether that might have been one of her brothers, and she sees in that fragility the echoes of her own family. The emotional weight resides not in statistics, but in small reverberations like that. Kolker also delivers warnings to readers from the scientific side. Be skeptical of overhyped promises of genetic determinism, of reductionist thinking. He cautions about ethical pitfalls, how large studies might strip anonymity, how families might become mere data, how narratives might distort lived complexity. He shows that in the race for publication, scientists sometimes overstate findings. Replication is hard, false positives rampant. He includes examples of false genetic leads, genes that seem promising, then failed replication, rare mutations that look compelling but later turned up in healthy people. Initial results inflated by small samples. The problem of missing heritability, that known gene variants explain only a fraction of the observed familial risk. He juxtaposes these technical frustrations with the human urgency. A child is ill, a mother pleads, a researcher wonders whether he might one day alleviate suffering. That tension between slow science and immediate pain is central. Throughout the book, Coker also illuminates shifts in policy, institutional care, and social conceptions of mental health. In mid-century America, many mentally ill people were warehoused in huge psychiatric institutions, overcrowded, understaffed, lacking dignity or therapy. The asylum model often became a trap. Then, the deinstitutionalization movement, driven by legal, fiscal, and patient rights pressures, closed many large institutions, but often forced people into inadequate community settings without support. The Galvins' experience tracks this arc. Some brothers institutionalized, then released, then homeless, then shuffled through short-stay facilities. The safety net was thin. Coker shows how medication evolved: chlorpromazine, haloperidol, then atypical antipsychotics, and how side effects like tardive dyskinesia, metabolic syndrome, sedation, cognitive dulling, weight gain, and cardiac risk haunted patients. Treatment was often blunt instrument. The hope of targeted medications, gene-based therapies, or neuromodulation remains distant. He also describes how brain imaging, MRI, PET scans, offered glimpses of structural and functional differences, ventricular enlargement, altered connectivity, but rarely clear causal stories. The brain is not static. It changes with years of disease, medication, adaptation. One high-impact example, the copy number variation, CNV, of chromosome 22q11 deletion syndrome, which is associated with elevated risk of psychosis. That began to suggest that rare structural changes could carry outsized risk. But the rarity of individual CNVs, the variable penetrance, and the challenge of generalizing from a few might limit their explanatory power. The point: disease risk can be concentrated in structural bracing in some people, diffuse in others. There is no one law, no single needle in the haystack. Coker's narrative also includes ethical debate. Families as research subjects, privacy, consent, the burden felt by descendants, the question of who owns data, the possibility of stigmatization from genetic risk profiling. Genetic studies sometimes skirt the edges of eugenics concerns. Can one test children early for risk of schizophrenia? What do you do with that knowledge? How do you prevent discrimination? The Galvins' cooperation is generous, but also emotionally costly. The story is not merely illustrative. Coker shows how the Galvin family's data have contributed to major discoveries, incremental though they be. Their genetics, their medical histories, their brain images and cognitive profiles are part of large consortia used by researchers to find small associations. Coker posits that even negative findings, things that were once thought promising but rejected, are valuable because they guide science away from dead ends. In that sense, the Galvins' contribution is enduring, even if their personal loss is irreplaceable. Through all this, the Galvins remain characters, real people with contradictions, failures, love, denial, courage, and despair. Don Galvin was strict and proud. Mimi was intelligent, ambitious, burdened. The children were talented, flawed, vulnerable. The sisters, in telling, try not to cast blame, but to reckon with moral complexity. Their parents did things they now see differently. Some things were beyond their control. They feel love, grief, anger, compassion. Their act of telling is part therapy, part reckoning, part offering to others. By the time the book ends, the scientific journey continues. No cure has emerged, no simple remedy. But genetics, neuroscience, psychiatry, and patient advocacy are converging into more humane frameworks. The disease remains brutal, but the possibility of early detection, gentler interventions, better social support, and more compassion gives faint light. The sisters' motive is not triumph, but resonance. If one reader walks away with one less stigma, one more empathy, one more curiosity about mental illness, then the long years of grief will have a measure of meaning. In effect, Hidden Valley Road is not a polemic, not a cheerleading science book, nor pure memoir, but a hybrid. Tragedy, case study, scientific odyssey, and elegy. It shows how families live through mental illness, how science advances slowly, how memory and storytelling buffer trauma, and how ultimately love and identity resist dissolution. If one traces a narrative thread from the opening moment, Mary entering the woods and sensing something hidden, through decades of confusion, wandering hospital corridors, genetic labs, memory's sharp edges, to the final sense of fragile hope, it is a story that moves from darkness toward clarity without ever claiming victory. It acknowledges that some wounds will not heal, that some minds will remain lost, that scientific progress is slow, but also insists that stories matter, that empathy matters, that families are not passive victims, but actors in a shared quest of meaning. If the reader holds one example in mind, let it be this. In a later chapter, a researcher shows MRI images of the brain of a Galvin brother, highlighting enlarged ventricles or diminished cortical thickness. But then he cautions, these differences are statistical, group level, not determinative for any one person. The danger is to think you can look at one individual and declare disease. That humility, the recognition that probabilistic risk is not destiny, is a central thread. The Galvins are one family, not instructive of all, yet their tragedy and their generosity helps science tip forward. By the last page, the house on Hidden Valley Road remains a haunting metaphor, a home that sheltered ambition and music and innocence, and eventually memory, absence, grief. The walls, once vibrant with children, stand as a memorial to what was lost. But inside that metaphor, the lessons breathe. That mental illness is not a moral failing, that science is gradual and communal, that families survive through story, and that empathy is among our strongest tools. In sum, Hidden Valley Road is a painful, illuminating, exquisitely told journey through family, illness, memory, and science. It offers no easy answers, but it gives permission to hold grief, curiosity, love, and doubt together. It is a call to see those suffering from psychosis not as abstractions, but as people, to understand that disease is never only in the brain or body, but lives in context, relationship, history, to push science toward humility, and to give voice to those whose minds have trembled in darkness. If I were to offer a tip or trick from the book, though it is not a self-help manual, it is to attend a narrative, to listen to stories of illness not as cases, but as lives, to balance statistical humility with human presence, to be wary of deterministic oversimplifications, to hold families, patients, scientists, and storytellers in a frame of mutual respect, and to remember, progress is incremental, but consciousness raised, stigma reduced, empathy grown is itself part of healing. That is the story of Hidden Valley Road. Grim, beautiful, unresolved, urgent, human. And that's it. Hidden Valley Road. Inside the Mind of an American Family by Robert Kolker. Thanks for listening to Book Nibbles. If you enjoyed this bite-sized book, don't forget to subscribe for more quick, insightful summaries. See you in the next nibble.